Talk to me about what you're doing in the world of startups.
Well, Cory, I have a lot of limitations, but I'm usually pretty good on the market transitions, from the role the internet played in our future, to voice becoming free, to global digitization. And you think about startups, the big picture is very simple. That's where all the job creation will come. I'm going to invest in 10 to 12 startups. It's going to be spread pretty evenly throughout the United States, and we can talk about that later, and around the world. They will vary from a drone startup to a defensive drone startup, to transparency in open government, to social media and how that will change the customer experience, to security around phones, to a company like PinDrop that you and I talked about in February of this year, moving from literally fraud detection to voice authentication, all the way to our next source of protein, which will be from crickets and from insects. Well, you will consume the majority of your protein 15 to 20 years from now on animals from areas like crickets.
Well, I want to break these ideas down. It's so interesting. Let's start with that cricket idea. So I want to know what the company is, but I think the problem is so interesting because, as you mentioned, protein is so expensive, the most expensive part of every meal around the world. It's also the most time-consuming thing to create. It takes 3 years to raise a cow, for example, before it can be used in the food chain, but also has a big impact on the environment. Talk to me about this cricket investment.
Well, basically, when I ran into the individual, Mohammed Ashur from Aspire Company at the Clinton Global Initiative, the last thing I was going to do was invest in the next generation of food supply. I thought that had nothing to do with technology, yet it has everything. Basically, crickets can be the most safe form of protein, raised at 1% of the space. We're running out of space to have the amount of meat proteins and agricultural proteins generated. It does 1/7 the environmental impact and at a dramatically lower cost. So you combine all this together, that the best way you can serve the environment isn't what car you drive or your home, it's the protein you put on your plate. Crickets will be a staple, in my opinion, and I'm pretty good with the market transitions, 15 to 20 years from now, are the majority of the protein that you consume. So it's a leap of faith, but it really talks about getting the transition with the Internet of Things, robotic cricket farming, capturing the cloud data capability to grow these faster and safer than we've ever done before.
I think it will be served in everything from
high-end restaurants to change world hunger.
Oh, yeah, no smaller goal than that. Where are you talking about in terms of markets for this cricket business?
Well, first, I think it can solve world hunger. But the second thing is you're going to see it go everywhere. The Atlanta Hawks are already putting it in their sporting stadiums. One of the top restaurants in America, Sejan's, is putting it into their restaurants. They are a Michelin 3-star restaurant in San Francisco. You will see it literally play a huge role in global hunger. So where else can you make a difference in every aspect of our lives, including the environment, than in this new source of protein for the future?
It's fascinating. Now, you mentioned a company we talked about.
It is. It's fun.
Yeah, it's great. It's got to be fun to do this stuff. You mentioned PinDrop, company we talked about back in February. Mm-hmm. The company's interesting, been through a little bit of a transition, sort of seeing where its technology works best. I would imagine it's part of your learning process too, having been through this with so many of the companies Cisco's acquired over all the years, and the startups within Cisco, to sort of see a market transition happen while a product transition is happening as well.
Well, you named it. I couldn't talk about it the last time we were on your show with Vijay, who's a brilliant young CEO there. And that's the common theme that you see across my startups, a great CEO and market transition. But when he got started, it was about fraud detection, and it's the top fraud detection in terms of call centers in the world, had 8 out of 10 of the largest banks. They're now moving to voice authentication. And instead of you and I being treated almost like a criminal when we call into our bank or our credit card with your mother's maiden name, what was your date of birth, all these statistics, they will do voice authentication, combine that with what device we're calling in on, our biometrics in terms of the rhythm we use on the device, etc., and change this from a negative experience to a very positive experience. So you're seeing a transition there. You're seeing the same transition in terms of government transparency with a company called OpenGov, headed by Zach Bookman. Basically, they provide transparency in the budgeting process and allow the government leaders and the citizens to see what you're doing and how you're spending your money. Sounds basic, but no one does it. State of Ohio, probably the lead here. They've moved from number 46 in the nation in 2 years by using this product to number 1 in terms of financial transparency. So what I try to do is get these transitions right in each category.
And just for a minute left here, in terms of startups, the drone startup you have is so interesting.
Well, the drones will change productivity in areas such as insurance or in areas such as mining, but also defensive drone, Cory. Unfortunately, you're going to see, I hope I'm wrong, in the next 18 to 24 months, a bad guy come to a coliseum or a government building and drop munitions on that location. You saw it already with the Mexican organized crime. You saw unauthorized drones flying over U.S. military sites, etc. Defensive drones will be as important as the offensive use. And so a startup called D-Drone, again headed by a young CEO, is just awesome. I think maybe one of the most exciting things to your viewers in the future as well.
John, this notion of getting to where the puck isn't yet, or where the puck's going to be, seems like it's so important to you. There's a lot of conversations right now about what the government's about to do as it relates to tax cuts, corporate tax cuts, repatriation of cash, all things that you've been a big part of discussing for a long time as a corporate leader. Does the government get it when it comes to startups in the U.S.?
I think only halfway. Cory, I think we're viewing this as transactions, not part of a bigger picture. The U.S. has traditionally led in startups. Today, we are not at all. In the first 5 years of this decade, we only grew our startup community by 12% over 5 years. Our peers like Australia, France, India grew by 40 to 60%. The Chinese grew by 100%. The Chinese do 4,000 startups per day. We are not entitled. We have to disrupt or get disrupted. You're now seeing countries such as France, which was the last place you and I would have done business 3 or 4 years ago, become the startup nation of Europe. You watch President Hollande and now President Macron lead in changing their country. But they don't do it by transactions. They do it by combining the whole picture together. GDP growth, startups, that's where all job creation will occur. How does that tie into your tax plan? How does that tie into your education system? How does that tie into your security? The U.S. is the only country in the world that does not have a national digital policy, of which startups is the #1 job creation engine everywhere in the world. So we're behind. And while tax policy change is important and creating the right environment for startups is important, we are lagging the rest of the world in the area that we must lead. So I think these were a good first step, but they're a step that we should have done 5, 10, 15 years ago. We need to think about where we want to paint a picture of optimism for our country, how startups will be the job creation engine, with large companies, Cory, not creating any incremental jobs in this next decade. 40% of them will go away. There'll be huge productivity there. If we're going to get 25 to 30 million jobs, it's got to be through a startup community, and it can't be at the anemic rate we are now. We are in last place, and we don't have a cohesive plan to tie it all together. We have elements in silos such as tax policy, etc.
Well, yeah, but even as Silicon Valley seems to be the envy of the world. I mean, everywhere I go, everyone I talk to says, you know, we're creating the Silicon Valley of the sand, or the Silicon Valley of the ocean, or the Silicon Valley of Boston, or the Silicon Valley of Israel. Or, you know, it seems that Silicon Valley is still held up as a model. What is missing there? What needs to happen?
Well, you said it very well. We talked about Silicon Valley as being the example for the rest of the world, and then you paralleled Boston 128, which used to be the example 2 decades ago. If you don't make it disrupt, if you don't, you've got to disrupt as opposed to be disrupted. It's got to be across all 50 states, not just in Silicon Valley. I'd argue Silicon Valley is a little bit out of touch with the rest of America about how we create jobs throughout the central part of the nation and the southeast part of the nation. And as I go around the world, let's use India as an example. Modi is looking at creating Silicon Valleys in all 29 of his states in India for 1.3 billion people. He's talking about GDP growth not at 3 or 4 or 5% and being excited. He's talking about 7 to 10%. JP Morgan just came out the other day saying they predicted India would grow at 10% per year. India is growing because of Modi's digital agenda, because of job creation, inclusiveness across the board. That's what you see in France. The last place you would have done business 3 years ago, and we said it become the startup nation of Europe. They set a pace to do this across the entire country. We need to do it in every state, in every city in our country, and we do not have a plan to do that. And then we got to bring education with us so the young people can participate in this future.
Is there something that could be done with with cash repatriation that would encourage startups? Because last time we had a big cash repatriation for companies, we saw that went into buybacks and dividends, didn't necessarily go into hiring. It didn't go into R&D. It just went into the shareholders' pockets, which, it's their company. I'm not necessarily against that. But if the goal is to encourage startups, and if the goal is to encourage business investment, what necessary policy do you think needs to be attached to any repatriation taxation policy?
Well, Cory, you've hit both the opportunity but also the challenge. We have to think of how we solve a problem, not with a single silo or questions. We have to tie them together. So we need a much more competitive tax system. Dropping the corporate tax rate for startups to 20% is a great start. We've got to then combine with, when you repatriate money, is this going to create an opportunity for startups? The answer is absolutely yes, because there'll be a number of startups bought and create a market where startups see an exit pattern as well. But the major thing we can't fall into the trap of doing, there is no golden single solution. You've got to say, how do you combine this in a policy that combines startup engines with tax policy, with education, thinking about how do we literally have a national startup mentality, and how do we capture the imagination of the Democrats and Republicans, not to argue about tax policy, which, Cory, you and I have been talking about for 15 years, but talk about the future in terms of the opportunity, inspiring hope that, again, Americans' children will have a better life than their parents. Right now, throughout the central part of the nation in the southeast, they don't believe that. And changing our education system. France is changing their whole education system around startups and digitization, partnering with Cisco. They will do it first with pilots, then they'll do it across the whole country. Why isn't the U.S. talking about changing an education system that is broke and doing it at speed? Key takeaway here, it's about innovation with speed. We're moving too slow. We don't have a national policy. This should be something the Democrats and Republicans are all over. Tax policy and repatriation is just one element of the equation. You need to say, how do we change the future?